It's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk remotely, sadly, to the 2022 iStart International Education Forum. My name is Alan Macfarlane. I'm the Professor of Anthropological Science at Cambridge University, some years retired, and a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge. And I've been interested in education for many years. I've also written a book with my friend Professor Liu about comparative education between China and England. And here is the title of the book, which came out recently in China. So if you would like to read further about what I'm talking about, here is the background. My own education is quite deep, quite traditional. I was educated at elite British boarding schools for 10 years, and then at Oxford University for another 6 years for a master's and a doctorate, and then another 2 degrees at the London University. And then I've been in education as a teacher at Cambridge for many years now. And I've written a number of volumes on my own education, exploring what I learnt and how I learnt it. So I'm very interested in the subject. And I'm also an anthropologist as well as a historian. And as an anthropologist, I'm very aware that education has to be understood within a social, intellectual, religious, and other context. Education is something like a tree. You have the educational system, which is on the surface, the branches of the tree, the trunk of the tree, the leaves, something you can see and examine its philosophy and organization. But what actually makes it into that shape of the tree and maintains and sustains it is what is under the ground, the roots of the education. And therefore, educational systems reflect their civilizations. In this comparative talk, I'm looking at 2 entirely different traditional civilizations. I'm not talking about education today in China or the West, but the system of education that went on until I finished at university in 1970, and the system which existed in China until roughly the Second World War. So this is what I'm comparing, and I want to look at various routes that led into what we now have, because obviously the past, although it is gone, influences the present. And so in order to understand the present education and upbringing of children, you need to understand the history and the deep history. The first difference I want to talk about is the relation between education and society. This really shapes how our children are educated. And the first aspect of that is the family system. The traditional English family system, which I was brought up in and is 1,000 years old, is very separated off. The family is very small, the effective family, mother, father, children, and the wider relatives are not very important, certainly when you grow up. So you grow up in this small, what is called nuclear family system, and you leave home, traditionally in England, and still today psychologically, at a very early age. You start to be separated off at the age of 10, 11, 12, historically, and you go off either as a servant or working for someone, or if you're upper class, to some kind of private institution, and you never can come back to your family. So our family and our society or education are separated off. Whereas in China, traditionally, as you know, there was a very strong family system, patriarchal, patrilineal, that is, tracing your descent through the males and with a lot of authority for the father. And the clan and family systems was very strong, and you remained a member of that family for the whole of your life. So in that situation, the school took you, if you went to school, and many Chinese started at a school but later stopped. If you went to a school, it was just to supplement, to give you a little bit of formal education in language and a few bits of ethics and other things. And that was just supplementary. The main education was in your own family. And so the school was in many ways peripheral. It was, as I'll explain, a gateway to promotion, but it wasn't really shaping you as an individual. Whereas in England, when you went off to your school, that became your world. The school was the beginnings of a wider society. You made friendships, you made contacts, you learnt skills, and you learnt character. And certainly my boarding schools were a lot about character and the formation of your identity and your character and your thoughts. So the school made you and separated you off from your family. A second great difference is that the English system is based on extreme individualism. From birth, you are trained in all aspects of your life to think of yourself as separated and as an individual. The individual comes first, the group comes second. And that means that schooling is about strengthening your individual identity, which later is expressed in our political system, our legal system, everything. Whereas in China, the group comes first, the family, the village, or whatever it is, and you are just a member, always, of a group. And so the educational system is not to break up the group as it is in England, but to make it more powerful. Another great difference is in the class systems. England has traditionally and still a very strong class system. That is to say, it's not based on birth and blood, but it's based on how you succeed through your life in particularly making money, getting a good job, having a reasonable education, many other class markers. And so education in England is class-based. I went to upper class schools, other people went to middle class schools, lower class schools. And so the educational system both reflects and reinforces a class system. Whereas in China, traditionally, there was very little in the way of class. China was divided between the high elite, highly educated mandarins and teachers and so on, and a great mass of people, peasants, small businessmen, all sorts of people. So it was just divided really on literary grounds, whereas in England it was divided on economic and social and other grounds. And that means that the purpose of an education system in England is to make your progress through the class system more successful, and that isn't the case in China. This is related to the way in which education and the economy are based. One very striking thing about England for many centuries is that it has had many specialized professions, that is, ways of making money. There were, of course, quite a lot of rural people, though not as high a proportion as in China. And there were, of course, quite a lot of ordinary people who were running shops or small businesses or activities like that. But higher up, it had specialized professions which were very well developed. These included lawyers, a large section of people training to be lawyers, doctors, soldiers, teachers, and clergymen, religious people, and there were others. Now, for each of these, you needed a specialized training, and so a place like Oxford or Cambridge had specialized degrees where you did one of these things, law or medicine or theology. And so the educational system higher up was a training in a profession. Now, for one reason or another, China really didn't have professions. There were many doctors, of course, but they weren't trained in universities or schools. There wasn't a big legal profession at all, solicitors and barristers and so on. There was no trained theological profession. You could become a Buddhist monk or a Taoist priest, but you didn't go to university or get educated for that. And likewise in the army, there were no army schools, or not many anyway. So basically in China, you were having a generic education, and it was only really as you went up through the layers of the Confucian education system, it was only really to train you for one thing, which was for bureaucracy, which was for administration. As you know, you started at the bottom. Almost everyone had a year or two of elementary education, even women in many periods, and then just a few of them would go on to the next level, and the next level, and the next level, until finally a tiny proportion would get up to the top positions in Beijing or wherever it was, advising the emperor. And at each stage, if you got up a little bit of a way, you could then go off and become teachers or local administrators or whatever it was. But the training basically was to be a bureaucrat. And in England, the bureaucracy was traditionally very small indeed, hardly any bureaucracy. So people were not trained to be bureaucrats. This did change in the later 19th century, or in the 19th century, as Britain became a great imperial power, and it needed administrators. So we introduced educational systems which were explicitly designed to be like the Chinese. In fact, we call our top administrators mandarins. And the idea here was that you would be trained for things like the Indian civil service. And I myself can see that my education was partly a training in becoming a member of an empire which had to run an administration in India, Africa, and elsewhere. So there was increasingly an element of that, but through much of history it was very unimportant, and you didn't train administrators. So this was a great difference. Another great difference was that the English have been capitalists, that is, the money has always been terribly important. Capital accumulation of money has been very important. Markets have been very important. And the business and professions have always been regarded quite highly. Businessmen and manufacturers are not at the top of our society, but they are recognized to be very important, and it's an honourable profession to go into, and particularly landowners. There was nothing shameful about trying to make money from your farming and so on. As you know, in China, there's been a strong anti-commercial element, an anti-money element in Confucian philosophy. The Confucian ordering of society puts peasants, ordinary farmers, above businessmen and commercial and urban dwellers. So the English educational system, although it wasn't geared to the making of money, it was quite prepared to see its students and pupils going on to universities and then becoming successful in business and industrial and other activities, whereas in China, higher mandarins would not go into making large sums of money. Another very important difference is between a Western Christian civilization like England and a polytheistic, many religion, many philosophy system like China. If you look at my schools, they were all founded as religious institutions, or at least my second boarding school was, and also obviously Oxford and Cambridge were originally monasteries and religious institutions. And even at my first boarding school, which was in many ways quite exceptional in not being very devoted to Christianity, it was a Christian school. We'd have services, Christian services every Sunday. We'd have readings from the Bible. We learnt a lot of theology. And so my education was a Christian education, and particularly in England, a Protestant education. And the same was true on the continent with Catholicism. In other words, religion and education were absolutely bound together in the West. You were learning about God as much as about mankind. In China, of course, you have many different philosophies, sort of religions, ancestor worship, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and as a result, there is no universal religion. You can believe what you like, and therefore education in China has no relation to religion, and this is a really fundamental difference. For us, religion is a spiritual matter, whereas in China that's far from being the case. And that leads to another feature which is very important. In our tradition of thinking in the West derives from Greek philosophy, and it's based above all on forms of logic which make oppositions. That is to say, you have A, which is very different from B, and they are opposed. So we have very strong beliefs that the world is divided between truth and falsehood, good and bad, beautiful and ugly, and many other binary, oppositional distinctions. And so all our thinking, and this spreads out into much of our life, is oppositional, A against B. And so you see that in all our games and sports and activities. For example, you have teams against each other. You see it in our legal system, where you have people arguing and disputing about who is guilty and who is not guilty. You see it famously in our political systems, where you have two parties fighting against each other. And you see it in our thought systems, where you're constantly trying to put forward arguments against another view. So our thinking and our activities is based on oppositions. And so this means that when you are educated, you're educated in a confrontational method. That is to say, you are taught to argue. The essence of the education I had anyway, and the one I give to my students, is to teach them to argue. So a good student essay, or even a good essay at school, said, this lot of people think this lot of people think that, and I think this. So you set up, as it were, games, mental games, in which you argue about the truth. And much of our education, therefore, is about teaching you the skills of argument, which will be useful in whatever field you go into. It'll be useful if you're in business, when you are arguing with other businesses or arguing for your plans. It'll be useful if you are a lawyer, obviously, if you're a politician. So our education system is giving you the tools of thought to question, to argue, to dispute, to try and get round, to try and overcome some opponent. And so we believe that education is to teach you to think. And by thinking, we mean arguing and finding out new and interesting things, discovering new things. So our education system from very early on, for example, in our grammar schools and in our universities, taught you things like logic and rhetoric, that is the way of arguing. And all the different parts of the education were dedicated to improving that aspect of your life. Now, as you know, Confucian philosophy and Buddhist thought and much of Chinese history is not about confrontation. It's not about argument. It's about harmony. It's about finding a consensus, a middle way, a golden mean, bringing things together. And it's not based on binary logic. It's based on what now is called quantum logic, both and. Things are both true and false, beautiful and ugly, male and female. And so in this constantly fluctuating world, you're not teaching children at school to take one view and then argue against another. You're teaching them to find balance and understanding between positions. And so that leads to an entirely different tone to the education. Education is not to teach you the tools of thought so much, so that you can argue well and speak well, but to teach you the important things which you need as you progress up if you're going to be a good administrator, which is things like memory. You have to have an excellent memory for all the precedents and all the information you need. Discrimination, deciding between different possibilities, fairness, judgment, all those things. And in that process, the main content is information. So traditionally, Chinese education was based on learning the classic books as you went through the system and the sayings of great masters, and then internalizing those so that you could use them later on in your administration. So Chinese education, like many educations, like Buddhist education in India and so on, was looking back to the great thoughts and ideas of the past and relearning them and then passing them on to the future. In England, right from the beginning, the education was not looking back to the past. Of course, you read the classics, but the idea was to move beyond that, to discover new things or to question the old things. So you would read a classic, but then you would dispute whether you agreed with Aristotle or Plato or whoever it was. And so it wasn't a matter of memory, it was a matter of tools of thought, as I've mentioned. And so the two educational systems have historically been very different, and this finally leads into the question of education and politics. The educational system of England traditionally was in a way separated from politics. You weren't training bureaucrats, and you were basically training people to be successful in a very bourgeois, middle class kind of civilization, where they would have professions if they were higher up, or make money lower down, and successfully make their way in a complex sort of society. So the educational system was quite independent. Oxford and Cambridge were independent of the royal power, and our schools were outside the political system in many ways. In China, the educational system was in many ways much more mixed up with the political system, firstly because it was very important that people were taught the right attitudes and thought in China so that they didn't undermine a very huge, complex, and in many ways fragile political system. So you should be taught to respect your elders and taught not to question the system. And secondly, you are being trained to be a pivot of the political system, because if you rise further up, you will become a vital part of it as an administrator. So politics and education are much more closely intertwined in China than traditionally than they are in England. So to conclude with this, the roots and the tree in England historically have been very, very different. Much of this will be known to you because the Western form of education, coming particularly from America and England and parts of Europe, are now very widespread in China. And so you will have absorbed some of this, but you may not have understood exactly what was behind it. And the present situation is now much less different. But I think the roots are still there, so that on the surface the tree looks quite similar. The schooling in China, as I've observed it on our many visits to China, and I've done educational projects in China, it looks a sort of similar sort of tree. But by looking down at the roots, you can see that still beneath the surface there are significant and important differences. And by looking down at the roots, you can therefore examine the situation of children in China, their closeness to their parents, the enormous pressure on the Gaokao and so on, because education is still the main avenue to social mobility, to climbing up through the system. And those things are still there, even though modern Western and other educational methods have come on top of them. So it's a fascinating situation where two trees have come closer together, and we in the West are also being strongly influenced by Chinese methods, and particularly in teaching of things like mathematics. And so we have a chance now to bring the best of both educational traditions, very ancient and rich traditions, together and learn from each other. So that's what I hope this talk will encourage. And again, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity of talking to you, and to wish you all happiness in your future life. 谢谢。